Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, telling a little bit of a story here. And this is one that doesn't yet have an ending. And we're all living this story. And so it's got to start, just like all stories do. It's going to be a little depressing for a start. It's got a big middle, and there's a lot of possibilities in here. And you're all going to help shape what the ending of this really needs to look like. So let me start off and say it's pretty clear that climate change today, post-COVID, is probably the greatest threat facing mankind. And we think, wouldn't it be great if there's a scalable path that creates dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over the next decade that also generates dramatic and sustainable revenue and impact on the planet? So my name's Steve Meller, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of CH4 Global, where we believe we're solving what are one of the key scalable ways to impact climate change. So the first is we've got to admit we have an issue. This is a quote from Barack Obama, which I think is a really important one. Obviously highlighted in red is what I want you to pay attention to. It is urgent and is getting more so every day. And I want to try to share with you what the level of that urgency really is. This is a simple graph from the United Nations GAP report, which they issue every year. Has 4 lines on it. The gray line would be if we did nothing about climate change, and it shows where we'll be in terms of the gigatons or billions of tons of carbon dioxide emissions on an annual basis, back from where we were in 2015 when the Paris Accord met and set in place goals. Now, all the countries in the world back in 2015 set some emissions targets, New Zealand included. You'll see that red line.
Good.
Important piece about that red line is it doesn't set us on a 2 degree centigrade pathway. It doesn't set us on a 1.5 degree centigrade pathway. That's if we meet those Paris commitment goals. So are we on the path to that? The answer is not really. These are 2 headlines just from the last 2 months. The one on the left is from the United Nations website. Pretty compelling when you go and read the article that the world is still a long way off, quote unquote. There's even an article from New Zealand here in the New Zealand Herald back about a month ago. Importantly, New Zealand's emissions are actually rising compared to other countries in here. So even if we met the Paris goals, we have an even bigger problem. And that problem is on the left, you'll see Paris commitments, all of these words on here, current policies that I had on the other one, and these NDCs, these nationally determined contributions, which are voluntary. These are the ones that countries offer up, did so in 2015, will so again in Scotland later this year in COP26. But on the right, what's important is what are those emissions going to be in 2030? And you'll see that Paris commitments lead to about a 10 gigaton. If we meet them, will lead to about a 10 gigaton reduction in carbon dioxide output on an annual basis. But if you look at what the United Nations publishes every single year in print, if you want to stay at or below a 2 degree centigrade world in the year 2100, and by the way, 2 degree centigrade is not a very good future. You have a third of the species on the planet that don't exist. You have most of the coral reefs on the planet do not exist. They've been bleached and are gone. Large areas that are used for agricultural basis in the United States and across Europe no longer exist. It's not a good world, but it's the best target we have today. But in order to meet that, there is an incredibly large gap between if we met the Paris goals and where we need to be in the year 2030, and it's 13 gigatons. And so what I want to do now is I want to sort of take you on a bit of a journey and say, well, what's it look like? How big is 13 gigatons? Again, assuming we meet the Paris goals. So let's give you a couple of examples. That's where we are, that's 0, and that's our target of 13. Well, we could switch every one of the 1.4 billion vehicles on the planet to an electric vehicle tomorrow. Can't really do that. It's impractical. There isn't enough rare earth metals to build all of the batteries, and you need to dig them out of politically and geologically sensitive areas of the planet using diesel fuel. But leave that aside. Leave it aside that you'll have 1 billion vehicles of waste. Just assume you could magically do it. That nets you 6.4 billion tons of carbon dioxide or 6.4 gigatons. Not even halfway to the gap if you electrified every one of the vehicles on the planet. That's how big that problem is. So give you a second one. How about you shut off all of the coal-fired power plants in the world and replace 2,400 and maybe 30 of them, replace them all with generated electricity from wind and solar. Again, impractical. If you shut off the coal-fired power plants, about 40% of the world's population no longer has electricity, but magically there's wind and solar. And unfortunately, magically, there's enough batteries to store it all. Where does that get you? 11 gigatons. Still doesn't close the gap we have if we meet the Paris goals. Give you another shot at it. Shut down all construction of every type, commercial, residential, and shut down all manufacturing of everything that you go buy at the stores and beyond. Sadly, it's 11.2 gigatons. Still don't close the gap that we have to solve for this planet in the next 9 years. How about you eliminate all of the emissions from China, every single drop? And I'll actually make it even better a picture because they're the largest emitter of greenhouse gas. Number 2 country, United States. Number 3, the EU. And number 4, India. Add those 3 all up together. Or take 167 nations on the planet from number 197 to number 30. Add all of those collectively up together, and you still don't close the gap. That's the hole that we've dug ourselves today. So what we want to find is ways that are financially viable for the planet, are geographically scalable today, they have manageable trade-offs as a planet, hopefully politically independent, because the rhetoric we get into around that is actually stifling many of these opportunities, and has a level of technical maturity. And the question is, does that exist? Well, turns out it does. And it involves methane. The topic du jour these days. The United Nations just issued a very large report talking about the impact of methane. So what about if you got rid of all the methane from all the cows on the planet? What's that impact look like? Well, it turns out it's 12.9 gigatons. It almost closes the gap from the 1.5 billion cows on the planet. So when I say no more methane, that doesn't mean get rid of cows, which is certainly what is being advocated in some circles. That's also not practical, given the fact that today we consume 200 million tons of protein on the planet, and in 2040, for a population of 9 billion, we need 200 million more tons. So taking away a food source that is the largest protein source on the planet today is just simply not reality nor practical. But there are other ways to do it. So we ask ourselves, the question is, are there things that work that could eliminate methane from cattle and other ruminants, sheep as well? Are they safe? And importantly, are they scalable in this next time frame? And there are. And it's this native red seaweed called Asparagopsis. You'll see on the slide here, I've given you about 9 or 10 different alternative ways that are currently going on today. New Zealand, for example, has great programs going on other alternative grasses and breeding programs, which is successfully done in sheep, vaccines. But there are also devices that people put on cows to absorb methane from here. There are probiotics looking to modify the rumen bacteria. There are other supplements that utilize a variety of natural materials. There's even synthetic chemicals that are being used in here. They're all 30% or less in terms of their ability to reduce methane on their best day in the studies that have been run. But if you look on the right, this native red seaweed I'll share more on shows 90+% efficacy in trials that have been run on beef cattle, dairy cattle, and sheep. So what is Asparagopsis? There are in fact 2 versions, a warm water one and a cold water one. They are native to Australia and New Zealand. In fact, the cold water version is uniquely native to both countries. In terms of, if you look in the middle, this fluffy red seaweed in here, all seaweeds produce naturally occurring substances, these things called halogenated bromines, for which one called bromoform is an example. But Asparagopsis is unique in that it actually stores and concentrates these levels of materials. And when appropriately processed, given to animals, less than 0.5% of the daily diet eliminates methane production in excess of 90%. You need to use the whole plant. There's no extracts from it. It is an entirely natural product. There's no chemicals added to it, and the only thing removed is water. You need to be really careful how you process it in order to retain this bromoform inside of these cells so that you can, in fact, actually use it in animals. It also shows, in addition to a reduction in methane, it shows an improvement in feed efficiency for the animals. And all of the data to date, with a few minor exceptions, would suggest that safety is validated for this material. So it works pretty well, appears to be safe. And then we look to what's happened in the last couple of weeks. This is a quote that's come out of a United Nations report that clearly says cutting methane is the strongest lever we have to slow climate change in the next 25 years. And part of the reason for this is it lives for about 12 and a half years in the atmosphere. So it's short-lived. So if you could eliminate it from cows, not only could you dramatically reduce methane levels and therefore carbon dioxide equivalent levels dramatically on the planet, you can actually help move the temperature into a cooler one. So here we are, 12.9 gigatons annually closes the gap from the 1.5 billion cows on the planet. And it's in excess of a $1 trillion market that does not exist today. But for the planet's security, needs to exist in the next 9 years. Cows, whether we like it or not, is the second largest global sector for greenhouse emissions behind energy, more than transportation put together. So what we're doing at CH4 Global is building the first, what we call market demonstration facility. This is not in a lab bench. This is very large scale of things, and trying to work out how do we optimize the end-to-end processing from aquaculturing seaweed, both in tanks and in the ocean, through all of the processing, through all of the formulation work, and actually then working with end-stage customers. So I asked myself, the question is, how could this benefit New Zealand? And it's pretty readily obvious when you have 10 million cows and 22 million sheep that you could dramatically change the face of agriculture. You don't have to go down by 15% cows, as was put forward in the climate change report. You have the ability to actually eliminate methane reduction from cows or ruminants, or essentially eliminate it. Create a multi-billion-dollar new aquaculture industry. It doesn't compete with the others. In fact, you can enhance the ability to grow fish such as salmon in aquaculture. Creates tens of thousands of new jobs in New Zealand, dramatically increases the GDP. The New Zealand market alone is in excess of $8 billion. Huge impacts on the environment, both from a land standpoint, cows being far more efficient, from an atmospheric standpoint of less methane and therefore impact on global warming. By the way, it's 86 times more impactful on global warming than carbon dioxide over the next 20 years. So it needs to be, which is why the United Nations put the report out saying it really needs to be the focus for here. And from a New Zealand standpoint, if you looked at the impact of the 10 million cows and the 22 million sheep in New Zealand, and you could eliminate it tomorrow and scale that business, you could actually take New Zealand to carbon neutral. So where we are at CH4, this is our mantra. What if we could delay the impending climate crisis? Put money in aquaculture and dairy and beef farmers' pockets. This generates revenue for them. Improve the lives of Indigenous people wherever we work. Help improve the world's oceans, reduced ocean acidification, reduced eutrophication from nitrogen and phosphorus, and make more protein available in the food chain. And we think not only is it possible, we believe that we can do that all with one approach. So I'm happy to take any questions. Are there regulatory barriers preventing Asparagopsis growth, harvesting, and use? Great question. There are certainly regulations that have to be satisfied in every jurisdiction around the world. What I will tell you is there is currently only one country in the world that has approved Asparagopsis for use and methane reduction claims, and that's Australia. So Australia is currently approved for use. We are working in New Zealand to discuss how this may go to market. A very good question, how much would we actually need? If you went to a map, visualize it in your mind, drew a circle around the islands of Fiji, that size dot is how much we need to supply 1.5 billion cows around the world. It's a lot, but it's actually about the same amount of seaweed that's already grown and consumed for human use today. So it's not like we have to do something that's an order of magnitude or massively greater in scale. Does it destroy aquatic life? Actually, it improves it. You must grow it in regions in which it is native. And if you're growing it in aquaculture, it actually improves the ocean by removing excess nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural runoff. It removes excess nitrogen from finfish in particular that are outputting it, so you can actually get potentially increased yields of salmon and growth. It removes carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, so you reduce ocean acidification. They are dramatic benefits in here. It's been shown for any seaweeds that it rehabilitates natural regions within there. Someone asks, what form is it consumed in? Is it processed into a feed or similar? Imagine that seaweed is processed into a very fine powder, and it can be simply, for feedlot cows, it can simply be mixed in. So it's less than 0.5% of the total diet. So if a cow eats 10 kilos a day, gets 50 grams of this. Someone also asked, is it in a bolus? And the answer is, depends on the cow. Beef feedlot cows, it can be mixed into the feed because they graze all day. Dairy cows, it'll end up being a bolus for formulations we've developed that'll actually release it continually over the 24-hour period. And then grazing cows that you don't see every day, there's a completely different set of formulations that we've developed in there as well. Someone's asked, what's the not so big potential safety issues? There aren't any. I gave that because there are certain parts of the value chain that don't really want to see this be successful. They have their own reasons, politically, academically, and corporate-wise. But the reality is the data that's been generated is overwhelming in terms of the safety profile. None of the material appears in milk. None of the material appears in beef. And there are very solid arguments from some of the best pharmacologists and testing individuals around the world to say why that should be the case. There have been one study run recently where somebody massively overdosed it purposefully, published it as a scientific article, not a particularly good one. It's been criticized enormously, where they found in one cow evidence of some minor issues, what I'll call minor in here. It's not been reproduced or repeated by anyone else. So the overwhelming data says it works and it's safe in terms of its use. Reduces methane. How does it reduce nitrate leaching? It does not. So a cow burps out 95% of the methane it produces. 5% comes out the back end in farts. The nitrate leaching that's going on is actually with feces that ends up on the ground in here. So it eliminates production of methane, and it does so very simply. It's an inhibition of an enzyme that produces methane from the last step in methanogenesis in the cow. So it actually, cows normally burp out 12 to 15% of the total calories they take in. That's why it makes them more efficient. You're not burping out the methane, you're keeping inside the energy that the cow gets from grasses and grains. So you keep it inside. Cows are more efficient at what they're doing. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.